Hello guys, my name is Simon and welcome to a brand new video. I hope you're gonna enjoy it. As sufferers of the existential crisis, more often than not, we're going to feel some sort of despair. We have those certain days where we feel some kind of hopelessness, where we don't really feel like anything can be changed at all, or at least something valuable cannot be changed at all. It's a strong, intense feeling, it's persistent, and it just ends up swallowing you up whole. It sort of makes you complacent in a very unattractive way. And that's why today I'm going to focus on the book called The Sickness Unto Death, or Sygdom til Døden, by our very own Søren Kierkegaard. Now I know you Anglo-Saxon people call him Søren Kierkegaard or something to that effect, however I'm going to stick with the original Danish version, which is Søren Kierkegaard. Fun fact! Kierkegaard means graveyard in Danish, so there's your answer to all of your questions. In this book, however, Søren Kierkegaard depicts despair as some sort of illness and not just a strong feeling that just grips us. However, before we dive right into it, there are 3 points we need to address first. Number 1, there's a debate going on. People are arguing about whether Søren Kierkegaard was a theologian or a philosopher. However, that's not really relevant to our discussion today, because if you're unable to take just anything away at all from his book because of the fact that he's Christian, then you're just too narrow-minded to be here. I'm sorry. Hashtag not sorry. Secondly, you'll notice that the book is written by a guy named Climacus. And there's a good reason for that, because Søren Kierkegaard employed a lot, and I mean a lot, of pseudonyms in his works. Basically, there are 2 groups of scholars. To some scholars, the pseudonyms are actually just literary devices. They are indirect communication, sort of like the irony that Kierkegaard employs in his books. And they don't believe that the pseudonyms serve a higher purpose. Other scholars, on the other hand, believe that the pseudonyms serve a higher purpose. And if you think you belong to this group, you should know that Climacus is just some sort of the ideal Christian to Søren Kierkegaard. An ideal, but not something he himself obtained during his lifetime. Lastly, Kierkegaard is sometimes a very structured writer and a very loose writer. He's structured in a way that everything is divided into categories and everything is subdivided into categories. And he's loose in the way that he does not offer any definitions. It's hard to pin down a term exactly because he deals with examples. However, you should know that he's an excellent summarizer, so you can always go back and reread the section that you probably didn't understand anything of the first time you read it. So, without further ado, let's dive right into this book. First of all, what is despair? Søren Kierkegaard depicts despair as some sort of illness, as I mentioned earlier. And quite literally, despair is a sickness in what he calls the self. However, that's not much of a definition, and I know. So in order to understand the properties of despair, we must firstly understand the self. The self is not one single thing, it's actually a set of relations between things. These relations Kierkegaard calls syntheses. So the self is made out of all these elements with a connection between them. That is a synthesis. You have one component here and you have the other component there. On one end of the synthesis is the element of the earthly things, and on the other one is the element of the divine things. Now Kierkegaard gives 3 examples. One of them is freedom and necessity, the other one is finitude, infinitude, and then there's temporality and eternity. So you should know that the self is not one single thing, it's your personality. Being a fulfilled self, you have to harmonize all of these things, all of these earthly components and all of these divine components. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because that means that your personality or your spirit is actually not fixed in time and space. You can develop. If you're still confused as to what the self is, I've made a nice drawing you can find in the description box below. Now that brings about the question of despair, because despair is a sickness in the self. However, how? Well, Kierkegaard defines despair as some sort of tension on these syntheses, or some sort of misalignment between the components. Usually it's not something major, it's not a major feeling you just get instantly like that. You just feel out of place, unnerved in some way. Despair basically is when people are unable to reach a fulfilled self. Kierkegaard distinguishes between 3 forms of despair. These forms of despair vary in degree, from the least conscious and least aware to the most conscious and most aware. Conscious of what? Aware of what? Well, of yourself, of your situation, and of despair itself. So in order to visualize it, imagine a tower. Now I'll go through the forms of despair. However, if you're still confused after that, there's another link in the description box below. Knock yourself out. The first form of despair Søren Kierkegaard mentions is the one where you don't know you have a self, or you're not aware of you having an eternal self. This occurs when people's sensuality is much stronger than their intellect. These people let their earthly pleasures take over their lives. Kierkegaard notes how these people think themselves to be happy, however truly they're not. These people are too sensuous to be courageous enough to become a fulfilled self. And Kierkegaard mentions that to murder their happiness is the worst thing that could ever happen to these people, because they are so dependent on their happiness. Now, Kierkegaard likens this condition of despair to being a house in 3 stories. The people who find themselves in this category of despair only find themselves living in the basement, which means they own an entire house, however they just stay in one place, they just stay put, they stay complacent. The key word here in this form of despair is misconception, and in particular misconception about your state of being. Finally, you should know that this is the most common form of despair, according to Kierkegaard. And that was the first form of despair. The second one is a true, heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching, just a section nightmare, really, just a section nightmare. Now, the people who are in this second form of despair know that they are in despair, and they know that they have an eternal self. However, they just don't want to be that eternal self, or in some cases, they want to be that eternal self. Now, I just said this was a section nightmare. What did I mean about that? Well, Kierkegaard yet again distinguishes between 2 forms of this despair, one being the weak version and the other being the strong version. Now, the people who suffer from the weak form of despair are usually, but not always, thrown into this state of being from the outside. They are literally only concerned with earthly matters. They feel this inner turmoil, they feel the inner struggle. However, they lack the necessary reflection to find solutions to this turmoil. So their solution usually is just to wish away, just to daydream. They wish to become someone else. Now, this is a problem to Kierkegaard, because these people, they just don't sit down and ponder what the self is or what despair is. This weak form of despair actually has a whole nother dimension, which is people who are concerned with the eternal matters, and they discard the earthly matters entirely. Now, this is yet another step up the tower, because in this case the self is aware or is conscious of its situation, its pain, its despair. Now, the people who find themselves in this form of despair, they just close off. They don't reach out to God, to the divine, in order to destroy their despair. They just suffer internally and suffer in silence. And this brings us to the top of the tower with the version of despair that is most conscious. And that's the despair rooted in defiance. This is the strongest form of despair, and it's the one that carries the heaviest weight of consciousness. Now, what's important to notice here is that it emerges from the self and is not brought on by some sort of external factors. The defiance coming from this version of despair is actually a spite so powerful it matches the highest levels of absurdity in existence. The person who finds themselves in this form of despair is in raging opposition to everything. The person who finds themselves in this version of despair actually has a torment that is so great they use it as a justification for their own cause. And Kierkegaard says that their wrath is almost demonic. And this form of despair is demonic because divine consolation is its sworn enemy. Why? Well, because it renders the person's existence utterly useless. Their whole foundation for life is the spite of life, the spite of themselves, the spite of existence. These are the various forms of despair that Kierkegaard outlines. And even though the forms intensify at every single level, every single moment spent in despair is actually pain, it's suffering. Kierkegaard actually compares all forms of despair to being deadly ill, to being dying, wishing you were dead at every single moment spent alive, wishing for that sweet relief, wishing to be free of all pain, of all suffering. Despair, however, is the constant denial of this sweet release and relief of death. And we are in luck because Kierkegaard confirms that yes, it is possible to rid yourself of despair entirely. Firstly, you have to notice that despair is actually sin. And it's a sin because, as Kierkegaard says it, it's actually a position and not a negation. That means that sin or despair is not the lack of virtue, it's actually more a state of being. And it's a state of being we all find ourselves in some of the time in our lives. Usually most of the time, but to some only partially. And every single moment spent in sin, every single moment spent in despair is another sin. So the fact that you are despairing is a sin in and of itself. However, the fact that you stay in despair is a sin multiplied. And it's actually the most severe form of sin there is. So if you're irreligious, or if you just don't believe this denomination of religion, then either way you're fucked, because you're sinning in spite, in the defiance. Kierkegaard actually presents a formula for the self that is completely without sin, that is completely without despair. This formula is a self that ponders transparently in the past that created it, while it relates to itself and while it wishes to be itself. To bring this a step down, this means that you should have faith in God whilst being able to harmonize all these elements we talked about earlier. And if you look at the necessary ramifications of Kierkegaard's theory, then God is not the only one you should have a nice relationship with. The self is not an autonomous thing. It exists in relationship to other things, other people. Basically, it's very much inherently defined by the relationships it maintains and creates. And this does not only include God, it includes our lovers, our children, our parents, our friends. Why? Well, because they shape who we are on a daily basis. So to bring this back to the relations we talked about earlier, to the syntheses we talked about earlier, on one end we have the divine, we have God, our relationship to God. And on the other end we have the earthly matters, which includes all the people we are going to know and all the people you already know. This means that you should maintain a great relationship with not only God, but with other people as well. Furthermore, these relations, they relate to themselves. These syntheses, they relate to themselves. And this suggests that you should actually have a healthy relationship with yourself, with your own personality, with whom you are. This means that the self is actually not just harmonizing our relationship to God and to other people, but to you as well. That means that even though if you're not a Christian, even though if you are a Muslim or a Buddhist or whatever, you can still work on those two essential relationships, other people and you yourself. So you may not rid yourself entirely of despair in the Kierkegaardian sense, but you can improve, and you should. So, whenever you feel like you're in despair, do something good for another person. Or more importantly, do something good for yourself. Buy that bag of Skittles, buy that bag of M&Ms, or go to the gym or whatever you do. My name is Simon and this has been my existential crisis with Søren Kierkegaard. Thanks for watching, bye.